A software engineering job is actually looked at sort of as a blue-collar job. It wasn't really until I sat down with some of my non-tech friends once. So let's get it out of the way first. LeetCode and coding interviews are completely broken. The main issue that people have with it is that it's way too hard and the questions asked have nothing to do with the actual job that you're interviewing for. Are they broken really though? There's all kinds of examples on Reddit, YouTube, and other sites of people who are asked like ridiculously hard questions on their interview and how broken the process is. And it's definitely evolved into a never-ending contest of engineers and companies being able to solve and ask harder and harder questions. So much so that these interviews sometimes require months of preparation. And every time you want to get a new job, you have to go through the process of restudying all these questions again because the concepts you use in these interviews don't apply on the day-to-day job at all. So much so that you just forget everything. This has been talked about over and over again in the industry, but I think it's important for us to understand the unique situation that software engineers, specifically in the United States, are in and why these interviews are getting so hard. And maybe in the end, we'll realize that they're not so bad after all. So when I first started out, I hated these questions. I kept making excuses for myself about how terrible these interviews were, and I would go on Reddit and look for people who had similar mindsets or experiences as me to validate my feelings about the whole process. And I always asked myself, why did I need to study hours a day just to get a job? And it wasn't really until I sat down with some of my non-tech friends once and I was talking about my study habits and how I was studying for hours and hours every day. And then they told me, but isn't that why they pay you so much? And I think being humbled and getting perspective is one of the most important things in life. So, perspective. Software engineers in the US are in this very specific privileged position compared to the rest of the world, especially if you live in major tech hubs throughout America. Let's take an example. In Japan, a software engineering job is actually looked at sort of as a blue-collar job. And I learned this from a video by Mayuko. Software over there is seen as secondary to hardware and is seen almost as an necessary evil. According to Glassdoor, the average salary in Japan is about 6 million yen, which translates to about 52,000 a year in USD. And the average salary in America, according to Glassdoor, is $118,000. Now, I know there's differences in costs of living and groceries, supplies, and other things, but you begin to see a little bit of perspective between the US and other countries. And this is not really just a Japan thing. This is similar to most countries across the world. Salaries for software engineers in other parts of the world just aren't as high as they are in the US. And now that we have the perspective, we have to ask, why do software engineers in the United States actually get paid so much? So let's take a look at this chart right here, which is the market cap for the largest companies in the world. And scrolling through, you can see they're actually almost all tech. And not only that, they're almost all based in the United States. And they make billions upon billions in revenue per year. These tech companies are fighting as hard as they can to attract and retain the top talent in the United States and the rest of the world. And how do they do that? They do it with salaries, stock grants, bonuses, free food, nice offices, great perks, etc. And then that's when you see these ridiculous salaries at some of these companies. It's basically because of a supply and demand problem where all these companies are fighting for the best of talent and they have to keep driving up their salaries for it. And with that, you think about, then how do these companies figure out who they want to take to do the job? They have to ask these LeetCode style questions because it's a standardized way of testing their engineers. They have to filter through thousands, if not tens of thousands of applicants per year. And the applicant pool just keeps growing and growing and growing. At the same time, there's an abundance of resources and everything needed for people to get better and better at these kinds of questions. And then the cycle continues because the company has to ask harder questions to filter out more people out of their applicant pool. It's said that only 0.2% of people who apply to Google are actually able to get the job. And that's after filtering through the application, phone screens, recruiter screens, technical screens, on-site screens, etc. It's harder to get into Google than it is to get into top college like Harvard. And rightfully so, if the starting salary is around 200,000 for a junior level engineer. So given that, I think we should all take a step back and chill a little bit. And I'll explain why. So I was recently watching a TikTok by a nurse I follow, and she was describing her life in healthcare. She talked about how grueling the life of healthcare is, and the long hours they have to work, training that they have to go through, the debt they accrue from grad school, and that they don't pay anywhere as close as top tech companies pay. And I also watched this video about a new grad investment banker who works 70 to 80 hours a week, and his salary was about the same as a software engineer. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and say my job is easy, but if you look at these other industries and think about all the time that is spent in grad school and how much they have to study to get to the position that they're in, suddenly you realize these coding interviews that you have to study months for are exactly the same, if not better, than these other industries in the amount of time we have to spend to do these. This is really not me trying to bash other professions or say that software engineers should make less money. If anything, other industries should have their salaries raised. This is just me saying we should take a step back and think about the unique position software engineers are in. If you take a look at a principal level engineer at Facebook, they make similar amounts of money to what a literal surgeon would make, and they don't require 4 years of med school, residency, all the debt accrued along the way in order to get there. So if you take all this into perspective, you realize that studying a couple hours a night isn't actually so bad if the rewards are this great. So if your goal is to get into one of these companies, then by all means, use all the resources online, go through the process of grinding through questions, do everything you need to make sure you get there. But if that's not your goal, I encourage you to take a step back. Getting into a top tech company shouldn't be your only goal in life, and you shouldn't have to destroy your own mental health or personal well-being in order to get there. There are actually plenty of jobs out there that don't require these coding interview style questions in order to get in. There's a whole list on GitHub of companies that interview without asking these kinds of questions. And personally, before my current job, I worked at 2 startups that don't even ask coding interview, leetcode style questions at all.